So in Sweden, there's been a long-standing debate. I know it's been in the Nordic countries. I'm not sure about the other countries. I know in Germany as well about having some kind of canon.
Yeah.
With all these sort of books that you're supposed to read and understand until you're integrated and grown up or whatever.
Yeah, I think the German had a term Leitkultur, that's a culture that would lead you or guide you or something. Yeah, we had that in Sweden too, and I don't know if it's still going on, but it sparked all these debates. You know, some people say, yes, we need a canon, otherwise you cannot be integrated in society if you're an immigrant, or if blah, 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 you need to read a certain set of novels and poems and books. And other people say, no, the canon is repressive, there should be no canon, there should be no canon.
What's your opinion on that?
Well, as I'm a philosopher, of course I have somewhat a complicated opinion about it. But I mean, on the one hand, of course, the canon will always exist. I mean, there's always be, regardless if you're a philosopher or an artist or a writer or whatever you are, or even if you're doing some of the natural sciences, there will be a canon of text or body of text or people that you will refer to, obviously, because otherwise you can't work. But that canon changes, right? I mean, what we do in the present, what kind of philosophy we're doing, what kind of artworks we're producing, what kind of books we read or write, that will transform the way we look at the past. I mean, if there's a new breakthrough in some field, this will rearrange the canon. Other names will appear, some names will disappear. So in that sense, the canon is always in flux. It's always being remade. There's no way to be without. It's like saying there should be no past. We can't live without the past. But the past changes, which has nothing to do with that we somehow distort it, or fake it, but because it changes because of our present needs. And of course there are works that do withstand the test of time. We will probably always read Homer and Sophocles and read Plato to that extent. We will probably always do that. On the one hand, because they are great works. I mean, in some objective sense, whatever that means, but also because our tradition has been produced through a series of accounts and readings and rereadings and reinterpretations of those works and there's a certain Western canon, of course. People are complaining about this, but if we were in China, we would read other novels, other epics, we would read other philosophers, we would read other texts. And so each canon is somehow local. There is no universal canon. There's no way you can say these are the works that all of humanity should read or appreciate or understand. This makes no sense. But I mean, canons are local. They are also more than local because they interact and they change. And of course, the Western canon is changing drastically because of globalization, because of many other things, as probably the canons you have in India and China and Japan are also changing. I wouldn't know that because I was brought up in the Western canon. But the canons are not closed, obviously. They change. But they change because of present needs. So in that sense, the debate is weird, because the canon, of course, can be repressive if you have a canon which is produced the way politicians want it, that the Ministry of Education says these are the books you should read. I mean, no one would read those books just because of pure, you would actually hate those works. So it cannot be determined by a politician or someone authority. It has to come from the inside, from the ongoing development of a certain tradition. And so canon is not repressive unless it is imposed from above, but there must be a canon. So in that sense, it's an ongoing process, and I have no objection to the idea of a canon. The word canon, in fact, canon sounds like weapon. It comes from the Greek word kanon, which means like measure or measurement or yardstick, and there was probably, we don't know, but there's a treatise which is now lost by the great Greek sculptor Polykleitos, which was called Canon, and it as ancient authors say, would have defined the ideal proportions and measurements of the human body for sculpture. So there's always this idea in the canon, that there is a measure or something, or beauty or perfection or something. But as we know, these measures, they change, and they change drastically over the period of time. And if in some works as a philosopher, if you read histories of philosophy, they change all the time. And so I would say, if you study the history of philosophy like 50 years ago, it would look not entirely, but largely different the way it does today, because new names reappear, other names fade away. So in that sense, canon is simply a part of the historical process.
But it's also constantly expanding as well, because you are adding things, not only changing, but it's adding.
It's adding new things.
And cross-references, it's completely... It sounds to me as it is impossible to actually name a canon at a certain point. You can name a canon, I mean, in certain local situations or regional, so you can say this is the canon of this and that particular field of investigation, but I mean, universally you cannot say that. And as I said, a universal canon cannot exist and probably should not exist, because it would always mean that some culture, some groups, some whatever would impose their norms on other groups. And there has to be a multiplicity of canons. They have to interact because they are not closed, but on the other hand, one has to respect the differences of them, and there can be no outside view to say this is the true canon. Everyone must read Shakespeare or Homer or Indian epics from the medieval ages. This doesn't make any sense, because cultures, languages and traditions are different. They are in a flux, they are open, but they're also different. And I think a lot of debates around canon are in fact unnecessary, because one either sides to one or the other option, but does not appreciate the historical complexity of canon. So for me, canon is not a problem, as long as we keep changing it. As long as we keep changing it and remain open to the fact that history is always remade on the basis of the present. And I think, someone like Gadamer, for instance, would say that, I mean, he's very much entrenched in the Western canon, but he would say that to interpret a work of art, to read Shakespeare and say, the King Lear, for instance, what does it mean? What does Shakespeare want to say? But I mean, what we think that King Lear means at the play is, of course, entirely dependent on all the interpretations and all the readings of King Lear that have occurred since Shakespeare's time. And there's no way we can... It doesn't even make any sense, if we would invent a time machine and go back to England and say, well, what do you mean? What was your intention to when you wrote King Lear? Maybe he would say something entirely silly, just for fun. I had no serious intention. So would that mean that all the interpretations would have been wrong? No, because the work of art, as soon as it's produced, or even the work of philosophy, escapes the intention of the author and has a life of its own, and all the readings that come later will be part of the work. So this is why it's also always changing, and this does not mean that everything is relative, you can say anything. It just means that to read something, interpret something, means to be at a certain place in history, and there's no way you can escape that. You cannot place yourself in some other period, you have to be here. On the other hand, you have to understand that this here where you are is also in a flux and will change. So in that sense, historically change, and claims to larger validity are not really opposed, but there are no universal values in that sense, because universality, I would say like this is very Foucauldian, I think. There's a lot of confusion about universality. Universality is produced in history, because if there is universal, it's simply outside of history. Universals are produced in history, but in any given point in history we are not free to simply reject or react universals, because they exist, but they have to be accounted for in this interplay between the finite historical time and the infinity of the idea of the universal. And we cannot lose any one of those two, and we have to keep both at the same time. And this is a philosophical problem, but it's also an aesthetic problem, and if you choose one over the other, you will destroy the whole sense of tradition. That's my opinion. It's a very long answer, but it's not the answer that will be given by a politician. I'm pretty sure. No, it seems that politicians are determined. Yeah,
but I mean, to integrate someone into a different culture, I don't know what it means. If I would move to China, always the imaginary other. If I would move to China, I couldn't become Chinese. I would carry with me my Western canon, but I would obviously attempt to learn Chinese, and I would learn to try to interpret the Chinese culture, and the Chinese history, literature, and the arts, etc. But I would still be a different something. So to integrate, I don't know what integrate means. I mean, you cannot integrate yourself by losing, but by getting rid of yourself. You are the person you are because you have a certain history, and I don't see that as something that is a problem that should be overcome.
No, of course not. No. Yeah. Okay. Let's make some pies.
Let's make some pies and eat. We're starving.